The gardens of TREWOOF. There sprang the violet, all new. The fresh provincial, rich of hue. And flores yellow, white, and reed. Such plant grew there nor in the mead. Chaucer. On the western end of the lady's bower, a window opened into a delightful garden, richly stored with flowers and delicious fruits. By opening the casements beneath the transom, one might pass out into this charming, secluded retreat. There was also a private entrance through the green court, by a broad flight of steps at the end of the alley from the grand staircase. As the ground rises rapidly on the western side of the mansion, the steps landed on a broad terrace walk, which conducted, at either end, through gardens and orchards, to the rabbit warren, fish ponds, and bowling greens, with garden pavilions, rustic seats, aquatic and other embellishments, which added much to the delight of old-fashioned pleasure grounds, which were always designed for use as well as for recreation. On the bank, sloping towards the morning sun, the ground between the mill brook, that still flows through the orchard, and the window of my lady's bower, would be beds of pinks and roses, sweet william and marjoram, clove gillyflowers of various colors, diffusing a perfume sweet as the spices of the east. The primrose, violet, and snowdrop might be seen peeping from the shady bank beside the brook, and lilies drooping over the stream. In all parts of the garden would be seen growing with little care or culture the daisy, primrose, violet darkly blue, and polyanthus of unnumbered dyes. The yellow wallflower, stained with iron brown. The lavish stock, that scents the garden round. From the soft wing of vernal breezes shed. Anemones, auriculas, enriched with shining meal o'er all their velvet leaves. And full ranunculus of glowing red. There the fresh provincial, rich of hue, may still be found, showing its azure blossoms and glossy leaves, mingled with many a garden flower now growing wild. On the sunniest spots were banks of lavender and thyme, alive with bees. The beds of flowers were edged with daisies, grass pinks, saxifrage, cliff pinks, or the fine-leaved wood strawberry plant. There were roses of various kinds to be found in all parts of the garden. The damask and cinnamon roses, with sweetbriars and honeysuckle, formed thickets of bloom which grew around uncared for, in every hedge. In more distant nooks and corners of this sunny retreat, where fair-handed spring unbosoms every grace, were sunflowers, poppies, whitsungillyflowers, honesty, and other showy blossoms, besides many other hardy old-fashioned flowers, now rarely seen except in some cottage garden, far away in the country. Yet these modest sweet-scented flowers are more worthy of a place under the bower window of a lady's garden than the scentless, flaunting, short-lived foreign flowers and shrubs by which they have been supplanted. Divided only from the flower garden by a hedge of roses, boy's love, southern wood, rosemary, toutsane, sweetbriars, and other common flowering shrubs, were aromatic herbs for pottage and distilling as balm, mint, summer savory, marjoram, tansy, organ, pennyroyal, and many others much esteemed by the ladies of old for making their strong waters and medicated drinks, worts, or tisans. Joining these, farther down beside the stream, were other beds of culinary and medicinal herbs. Among these were always found sage, rue or herb of grace, the dragon plant, fennel, and besides many esteemed wild herbs were often cultivated in the ladies' herbery, that they might be found at hand, such as agrimony, horehound, vervain, valerian, comfrey, betony, burnet, st. John's wort, mugwort, and scores of others, little thought of now that more powerful kill or cure foreign drugs are found to make quicker dispatch than the native plants, which one might have thought nature would have placed where most wanted. Farther up the sunny slope, nearly opposite the bower window, under a sheltering hedge of holly, bays, box, and privet, protected on the north by a close-cut hedge of yew, were placed the rows of beehives. Here their delicious task the fervent bees. In swarming millions tend, around, athwart. Through the soft air the busy nations fly. Cling to the bud, and with inserted tube suck its pure essence, its ethereal soul. And oft, with bolder wing, they soaring dare the purple heath, or where the wild thyme grows. and yellow load them with the luscious spoil. In swarming time the bees could be watched by the lady and her damsels, as they wrought at their tapestry or embroidery, or spun the flax with distaff and spindle, in the cosy window-seat of their bower. In the 15th and 16th centuries, when sugar was an expensive luxury, only to be procured by the rich, the care and cultivation of these interesting creatures was well understood and attended to. As vast quantities of honey were then used for brewing mead leaven which was more esteemed than any but the richest wines. Then, as now, the bees were regarded as having some mysterious sympathy with the weal or woe of the families to whom they belonged. On this account, if any important event happened in the family of their owner, it was thought necessary to tell the bees, and, in the case of death, to place some mourning on the hives. Otherwise it was supposed that the bees would fret themselves to death. What would appear to be the same fancy or feeling is still further indulged, and shows itself in what appears a greater weakness, to all but our simple country dames, with whom it is a general custom to hang crape on their window plants. Under the idea that, if neglected, the plants would pine and die, there are many other strange fancies among us connected with the bees and flowers, but they are not of such special interest as to be worth mentioning. On the other side the stream, between the brook and the orchard, a large piece of level ground was enclosed, with sheltering hedges, for the potager or kitchen garden, where abundance of esculents were cultivated, many of which are now but little known, as they were neglected when the culture of the potato became general. Early kinds of peas and beans were cultivated in this garden, those intended for winter's use being grown in the fields. The lentil was then much esteemed here, as now on the continent, for making more savory messes during fast days than any other legumes, some few coleworts. A small perennial beet, much esteemed for its succulent leaves, which were used with parsley and other things in savory fish and herby pies. This useful plant may still be found, growing about the hedges of what once were the gardens of old seats. We have, not long ago, also seen this excellent, yet neglected, native esculent growing wild near Hale. This hardy plant may be found on many sheltered parts of the seashore, and deserves to be better known, as it is equal as a spring green to any spinach. It continues green during the winter, and produces abundant seed in autumn without the parent plant dying. We have not botanical knowledge onowug to know if this plant be a true beet or some species of endive, but we know it was called a beet by the old folks who used it, and that it is a vegetable worthy of a place in any kitchen garden. Besides the plants mentioned above, carrots, parsnips, and many others for salading were then grown, as lettuce, rocket, mustard, watercress. Young shoots of the hop plant were also used as a salad, and boiled as a potherb. The hop was probably grown for these purposes long before its flower was used for flavoring and preserving ale, as the ground ivy, or ale hoof, wormwood, mugwort, centaury, the tops of bannel, broom, were formerly used for that purpose. As well some other aromatic bitter plants. A warm corner of this garden was also devoted to a class of plants which were much used for flavoring the strong waters, or spirits, both of home and foreign distillery, and as a substitute for the rarer spices of the East. In the simple confectionery of the ladies of olden days. Among these were angelica, licorice, saffron, coriander, caraway, gentian, to these may be added lovage or wild celery, fennel, and some others of less note. Most of these, except the three former, were cultivated for the sake of their strong carminative seeds, which furnished a variety of flavors to which the drinkers of old-fashioned cordials and liqueurs were much attached. Cummin seed is also mentioned in old recipes for flavoring cordials and also as an ingredient in the nostrums for attracting pigeons, and attaching them to a deserted dovecot. But this plant, being a native of warm climates, could hardly have been cultivated here. Yet, within our remembrance, many elderly person, who stuck to old customs, grew all the plants, and many more than we have enumerated, in their pleasant old-fashioned gardens, where things for use, combined with those for ornament, added much more to the interest of a place than the things for show alone which we find in our model gardens, that make the French and other foreigners characterize the English garden as a place very pretty to look at, but where there is nothing to eat. Anyone who has seen the gardens of the old chateaux of France, with their ornamental fruit trees, can well understand how uninviting and naked the modern English garden must appear to them. The garden-loving priest, attached to the house, would take care that abundance of such roots as carrots and parsnips were grown, as well as leeks, onions, sieves, and garlic, and every other plant food for cooking with dry fish. And, as ingredients in Lenten pies and meager dishes, parsley and marigolds were found growing, self-sown, all over the place. The main crop of peas and beans were grown in the fields. Peas were usually sown broadcast, and harrowed in the same as barley and at about the same time. A considerable piece of pillas or naked oats was also sown, before good substantial porridge gave place to lazy-made slops, or what is intended to pass muster for tea. It is a great pity that the cultivation of this hardy grain, which will flourish on almost any dry, poor soil, should be neglected. The number of fields, still found with the name of parkin pillas, is a proof that it was regarded as a most desirable product. And anyone who has ever made a hearty breakfast on milk, thickened with parched pillas groats, will weigh that it is far superior to rice, or to many other duty-paid farinaceous matters, with strange names, that we get from abroad. Many other sweet or savory dishes may be made from this nutritious, bone-producing grain, which has the same appetitive flavor as the best Welsh oatmeal. The fruit gardens. One of the pleasantest walks to be found in the gardens of the Norman gentry, at the time that the levellas flourished in Trove, was the trellised alley of checkered sun and shade. That this fragrant retreat was regarded with much pride by the old, garden-loving gentry of France, one may know by the frequent mention made in the old lays of Brittany and in Norman romances, of the trellised vine-shaded alley. And the grand arbor covered with every sweet-smelling flower, where the lovers often met, and where many a strange adventure frequently took place, and long time after maiden they, who heard this adventure allay, of the grief and the dolour, that for love these did endure. These favourite promenades are still to be found in the gardens of the more conservative parts of the continent, where all the horticultural traditions are carefully preserved respecting everything that appertained, in the good old times, to seigneurial and conventual gardens. In the latter, the beauty of the well-cultivated grounds was often enhanced by the dreary surrounding desert, in the midst of which the early founders of monastic establishments usually fixed their abode, and soon made the wilderness flourish like the rose. Some 30 years ago we saw, with much regret, the ruins of many of these fair, trellised alleys, in the deserted gardens belonging to the spoiled convents in the Basque provinces. More recently we have enjoyed the freshness and fragrance of these bowery vine-covered walks in the seigneurial gardens belonging to some old French families of Lower Canada, where the good, simple, honest inhabitants preserve everything connected with gardening, and retain most of the other customs of La Belle France at the time they left their Norman valleys and Provence roses to follow their heroic Sebastian Cabot and Jacques Cartier to the new Acadia. Here the only grapevine that stands the intense cold of the winters in the lower province is the indigenous kind, which is almost worthless, as its fruit, known by the name of Fox's grapes, is very poor and sour, and not much larger than fine currants. When the less hardy sorts of vines are grown, they are taken off the trellis, on the approach of winter, laid flat on the ground over a thin layer of bushwood sprays, to serve as drainage, and lightly covered with straw to protect them, until the snow blanket falls and keeps them safe through winter, when the mercury and salt water are frozen and the Canadian farmer bring their milk to market in baskets, or folded up in snow-white napkins. The hop plant, Major concolvulus, and several native creepers, which may almost be seen growing as soon as the snow leaves the ground, are trained among the grapevines to make a denser shade during the 2 or 3 months when it is as hot there as in the tropics, notwithstanding its Russian winter. It is often remarked that the inhabitants of Lower Canada are more French than the French are themselves, and many of them take so little interest in what is going on in the rest of the world, that they think the descendants of the Grand Monarch still occupy the throne of the country in which they believe that their ancestors were all people of note. From the gardens of this conservative race we may venture to copy anything we find, for the reconstruction of our ancient pleasure grounds, as we may be pretty sure that the same modes of gardening, as far as climate would admit, prevailed in France and England 3 or 4 centuries ago, when, from the frequent pilgrimages of wandering penitents and restless palmers, to and from southern and eastern lands, everything worthy of imitation, or cultivation, that could be brought from Paynim or Christian countries was introduced, and naturalized, if possible, in the gardens of conventual establishments, the occupiers of which were often as celebrated for their horticultural skill as they were for graphic and architectural arts. Small fruit gardens, trellis walk, pond, and pavilion. After this long digression, we may suppose that from the middle of the terrace, we have mentioned as passing north and south at the lower part of the various gardens, a few steps ascended to a straight alley, at right angles to the terrace, which, crossing the flower garden and a rustic bridge over the Millbrook, passed through the gardens devoted to the growth of small fruit trees and bushes, to a gate in a high yew hedge which divided these gardens from the orchards. Each side of this walk was bordered by such shrubs and trees as either grew, or might be kept, in formal shapes by pruning. These were varied by choice flowers and such fruit trees, interspersed, as are more ornamental by far than many plants and shrubs grown for mere embellishment. Among others, one was sure to find the medlar, mulberry, quince, filbert, dwarf cherry, and dark crimson-flowered crabapple trees. Here and there drooping trees arched their pendant branches over the walk which led to a gate of Gothic screenwork, which was seen between a pair of wrought granite posts surmounted by sculptured, urn-shaped ornaments. The gate and its supporting pillars were canopied by an arch made by the spreading branches of yew, extending from the closely clipped hedge. Through the orchard, beyond the garden, might be seen the alley, turning with graceful curves towards a fish pond on one side, and the rabbit warren on the other. A short distance from the brook, the formal walk, which passed through the gardens of small fruit trees, was crossed by an alley about 8 feet wide, covered with horizontal trellis of willow, or osier, one supported on strong poles of ash, elm, or oak, about the size of hop poles. The rods were fastened together, and to the poles, with tough twigs of the tree or Huntingdon willow. Vines, of all the most hardy kinds, were trained up the poles with a single stem and allowed to branch out over the trellis from either side. On the trailage, between the poles, choice dwarf fruit trees and myrtles were extended as espaliers, or the spaces filled in with flowering shrubs, honeysuckles, and other creepers. The walk through this shady bower would be about 4 feet wide, leaving a border of 2 feet on each side. These were edged with the delicate-leaved alpine or wood strawberry, which would there be found in flower and fruit best part of the summer. On either hand violets, primroses, cowslips hanging their dewy heads, lilies of the vale, fragrant hyacinths and jonquils, and many other choice flowers, which thrive best in partial shade, perfumed this bowery walk, and decked it with endless bloom. Near the southern end, the bower alley was widened to 10 or 12 feet. The flower borders here gave place to velvet turf of the brightest green, in which the chamomile was thickly planted, that it might give out its refreshing, strawberry-like perfume when walked on. And here were placed seats enough for a goodly company, if they chose to partake of a banquet in the fresh air of the garden. From this bower there was a glimpse of the changing sea between the ivy-covered gable and the wooded hills on the western side of Lamarna Vale, and here the murmuring main was heard, and scarcely heard to flow. All around the choicest climbing plants were trained, with roses, myrtles, eglantine, and honeysuckles in profusion. Near the southern end of the arbor was seen a miniature cascade, falling over long, moss-grown stones, by which the brook was dammed up so as to form a broad smooth canal. This canal, or piece of smooth water, with its banks fringed with hazel, like a gently flowing river, came into the garden between high and thickly wooded banks that separated the garden from a meadow where grew many old, yet still fruitful, apple, pear, and plum trees. On this meadow orchard, poultry, house lambs, and other young cattle were allowed to range at pleasure, and here the water, spreading over a broader space, gradually lost its artificial character. The thickets of hazel, and filbert, and other trees that flourish in moist ground, threw out their spreading branches and twisted roots to give shelter and shade to waterfowl and fish. And the green branches bending over the water with the weight of their cluster of nuts, made a rich frame to the liquid mirror. The high bank or hedge, which served for a fence and shelter the garden, was thickly planted with holly, hawthorn, elder, wild cherry trees, and mountain ash, with barberry bushes, privet, and other plants of lower growth between. From either side the opening in the woody bank, through which the waters flowed, broad-spreading alders shot out their branches, and formed a verdant arch over the tranquil water. Here, near the brink of the bank under the pendant branches of the elder, grew tufts of the water flag, with its sword-shaped leaves and yellow flowers, bordering brakes of reeds and rushes. On the more sunny edge of the bank, majestic plants of flowering fern, Osmunda regalis, hung over the smooth water, where one saw their regal, feathery fronds, mirrored with all the grace and freshness of their tender verdure. At the foot of this inaccessible bank, among the reeds, rushes, and soft sedgy grass, the swans made their nests, and a secure retreat for their young brood. When the cygnets were a few months old, the lady of the mansion no sooner came to her garden bower than the stately swans, followed by their young, and other waterfowl, at a respectful distance, would leave the sunny bank, or shadowy nook, and come sailing down, arching their proud necks to see their snowy plumage reflected in the water, till they came to the cascade, where they would leave the brimming river, that was ever, without o'erflowing full, come to the bower, and take the bread from the lady's hand to their young. Or, later in the season, when the cygnets had become as tame as the parent swans, old and young would leave the water, and here, among the fresh blooming flowers, these graceful birds delighted to remain whilst the lady and her fair damsels portrayed with their fairy needles, and silk or wool of brilliant dyes, the love-sick heroine on her tower watching the ardent Leander breaking through the flood. Or, the majestic form of the sorrowing Dido bidding adieu to the wandering Aeneas. Or it might be the scene of some more recent story, that the minstrel sung the while, graced the canvas, for then the rooms with costly tapestry were hung, where was enwoven many a gentle tale, such as of old the rural poets sung, or of Acadian or Sicilian vale, poured forth at large the sweetly tortured heart, or sighing tender passion, swelled the gale, and taught charmed echo to resound their smart. While flocks, woods, streams, around repose and peace impart. Perchance some wandering troubadour would hither wend his way, strike his harp, and sing some gay song of Provence, or tender lay of Brittany. Then some old romance of chivalry would while the time away, and transform the blooming garden into the fairy domain of Avalon, and recall the times of pomp and splendor, tilts and tournaments, when ancient chivalry displayed the pomp of her heroic games, and crested knights and tissued dames assembled at the clarion's call, in some proud castle's high arched hall. In some proud castle's high arched hall. Or they might be moved to tears by hearing the sad trials of the patient Griselda, or the melancholy legend of the fair Melusina. Ange par la figure, e serpent par le reste. Moved them to pity, honor, love, and hate by turns. In those times, the story of Melusina was held to be perfectly true by people of honor, as well as by the old wives, who then were quite familiar with fairies, dwarfs, and giants, and the transformations effected by fays and enchanters. Many of the old Norman nobility were supposed to derive their lineage from this enchanted lady, who was said to be, at times, half woman half serpent. As they were ambitious of showing a descent from her, they must have been proud of the dread fame of their ancestors. So true it is that many would rather be connected with a demon, of note, than pass unremarked among the crowd. 2 or 3 centuries ago this legend was related in hall and bower, as well as by old crones around the kitchen fire. Cately, in his Fairy Mythology, speaking of the fay ladies of France says, of these fees the most celebrated is Melusina, who was married to the Count of Lusignan. Towards the end of the 14th century, Jean d'Arras collected the traditions relating to her, and composed what he called her Chronicle. Stephen, a Dominican of the House of Lusignan, took up the history written by Jean d'Arras, gave it consistency, and cast such splendor about his heroine that several noble houses were ambitious of showing a descent from her. Those of Luxembourg and Rohan even falsified their genealogies for that purpose. And the House of Sassenage, though it might claim its descent from a monarch, preferred Melusina, and to gratify them it was feigned that when she quitted Lusignan she retired to the grot of Sassenage, in Dauphiny. We should not have said so much about the story of the fair Melusina had it not been that some traditions of a similar legend still linger about Penderswick Castle. A well-known scientific gentleman informed me that several persons of Brieg had told him of some curious traditions about a lady of Penderswick who, by means of enchantment, was often seen, wholly or in part, in the form of a serpent that long haunted the ruins after the lady's decease. No doubt the story of Melusina was often told here in days of old by wandering bards. And centuries after, all but the most striking parts of the legend being forgotten, the little that was remembered became located and associated with the ruined castle. A few steps below the northern end of the covered alley, the channel of the mill stream was contracted for the purpose of making a more rapid current. And here were placed on the stream 2 norias, or Persian wheels, of curious yet simple construction. The axles of these machines terminated in hook handles, at which grotesque puppet figures were placed with the handles in their hands. These effigies, so contrived as to appear to be working for dear life, in turning the wheels, were such figures of fun that none but the sourest could behold them without a hearty laugh. The norias and their puppets added to the gaiety of the scene, and raised a streamlet from the brook which was conducted, over the tiny river's bank, to a small pond, surrounded and shaded by overhanging shrubs and drooping trees. Close by the pond, was a pavilion fronting the vale, and a window in the southern end. This garden house opened on the pond, where the speckled trout might be seen leaping out of the water, tempted to display themselves by the shining dragonflies that sported their wings of brilliant hues close over the surface of the water. When the shades of evening came over the water, these tame fishes might be seen in shoals leaving their secure abodes, beneath the tangled roots of pendant trees, and swimming in on the steps which descended into the pond. The stones were only covered with an inch or 2 of water. In they came, boldly, to seek the crumbs and other food usually brought to them at that time. So familiar had these happy fishes become with the footsteps and voices of those who brought them food that they no sooner heard the lady in the pavilion singing some old ballad, or heard the music of her harp, than old fishes and young fry swam together to the shore of their hap-home, and seemed more intent on the music than to care for food. The third stroke on her gold harp she struck. So sweetly she made it ring. The little fish that went in the stream, he forgot whither he would swim. Through the arcaded front of the simple garden house at this end of the trellis, there was also a view of the vale, and a glimpse of the sea here and there between the trees. On benches, as well as suspended overhead, from the roof timbers of rustic building, were many hives of bees. Rows of hives were also placed on shelves against the inside of the southern wall, holes being left in the wall for the passage of the bees. Instead of leaving the place, swarm after swarm had fixed themselves unobserved under the rafters, from which the combs hung within reach, dropping with honey. Though the place was all alive with bees, they never stung any to whom they were accustomed, who did not molest them. And here, too, the ladies worked and sang, as cheerily as the birds among the apple blossoms greet the rising run in the flowery month of May. The Warren, Pigeonry, Bowling Green, Mill, and other ancient places. The orchards of Trove were formerly remarkable for the variety and excellence of the rare sorts of apples, pears, plums, and other kinds of fruit, now seldom found in this neighborhood except in the gardens belonging to ancient places which have mostly been occupied by the proprietors. Mulberries, quinces, and medlars were formerly well known here, and would be found growing near the walk which passed through the orchards to the rabbit warren, higher up the hill. The warren was about 2 acres, securely walled in. Artificial burrows were made for the security of the rabbits, and a few rough rocks left here and there for the greater enjoyment of the bunnies, or of those who watched them, through openings in the warren wall, chasing each other by hundreds together, over the rocks and around the bushes, of moonlight nights, or morn and eve, nibbling the dewy clover between their turns of skipping and frisking. Hares often found their way into the warren and had to remain there, as the openings, at the foot of the wall, through which they entered had wire gratings on hinges at the inner end. These gave way to the hares when they entered the warren, and they were so constructed that they immediately closed after them and so prevented their escape. Rabbits, hares, kids, and other pet animals were kept in the warren more for pleasure than profit, as the hills and moorlands abounded in game, and the lord of the domain delighted in the sports of the chase. It was merely one of the delights of this old place, to see these wild animals enjoy their frisky play within a minute's walk of the lady's bower. The pigeonry. Another structure, for ornament and use, pleasure and profit combined, was the pigeon house erected on the corner of the rabbit warren, with the orchard on one side, and the meadow which served for the poultry run on the other. This pigeon house was a tower of 9 or 10 feet square within, about 30 feet high, divided into 3 stories, of which the uppermost only was the dovecot. The lower part, from which one entered the warren, served as a place of shelter, and for other purposes. The next story was intended for a lookout, and an occasional apple chamber. This room had windows on 3 sides and a door opening on the top of the warren wall, which for a few yards on this side, next the sea, was 6 or 7 feet wide and formed a pleasant terrace walk, overlooking the warren, orchards, gardens, and house. The only parts seen of the mansion were the turret-like chimney stacks and peaks of the gables just peeping over the trees of the orchard. Clear over the roof, and on either hand, one had a view of Lamarna Vale, Trevella Cairn, the distant hills, and the boundless ocean. Stone steps led to this terrace, and the door of the pigeonry in the upper story was reached by placing a ladder on the terrace, by which one ascended to a small balcony and a door, over the one to the lookout. This entrance was used when squabs were wanted for pies, and for giving the requisite care and attention to these birds of luxury. There were entrances for the pigeons in a rising above the roof, and consisting of small holes, 3 or 4 by 12 or 14 inches. 3 ranges of these were placed over each other in a boarded front looking towards the south, with a shelf TD each range. The interior of the pigeon house was either lined with hose in the walls, as they are usually made on the outside of the buildings, or by horizontal shelves. Divided vertically at 3 feet distance, which were generally esteemed preferable to any other mode, the width of the shelf about 20 inches and the height between shelf and shelf 18 inches. And a slip of board 3 or 4 inches high, carried along the front of the partitions to keep in the nests, also a partition fixed in the middle of each 3 feet division, thus dividing it into 2 nests. We have been, perhaps, tediously minute in describing the columbier, because they are always ornamental structures and were regarded as indispensable appendages to the manor house. Besides, in these old-fashioned pigeonries the birds were easily kept free from vermin by having the nests frequently cleaned. To facilitate this the board in front was mostly contrived to slip up and down in a groove, by which means each nest could be cleaned at pleasure. The dung, most valuable as a manure for melons, cucumbers, and all other plants of the gourd tribe, will soon repay a little extra expense in making a comfortable habitation for these beautiful birds. Tares, and other pulse of the lentil tribe, as well as buckwheat and hemp seed, were regarded as good for a change of food for the young. Until they became strong enough to roam abroad and seek the wild grains and insects which constitute great part of their living. The lady of the mansion, who was too proud of her pigeons and poultry to turn them over to the tender mercies of her servants, regularly, morning, noon, and eve, fed and inspected her feathered favorites. As soon as the pigeons, perched on the roofs, saw the lady leave the granary, with a basket of corn on her arm, they flew down, alighting on her head and shoulders in such numbers that she was compelled to scatter the grains on the way. As she passed through gardens and orchard, followed by her fluttering train of doves. The old mural pigeonaries were among the most pleasing and picturesque features to be seen about the ancient manor houses, and were often highly ornamental when they rose, tower-like, among the group of farm buildings. With the roof surmounted by an elegant louvre, in which the entrance was made, on the south side, for the pigeons. The Bowling Green. The inner end of the avenue was formerly called the Bowling Green. Probably this was the common playing place, and there would be some warm, dry, and sheltered enclosure at the end of the orchard, surrounded with high hedges of yew, laid with the smoothest turf, and having covered seats at the end where the pins were set up. For a good description of an old-fashioned bowling green, see the account of Mr. Shandy's, before Uncle Toby and Corporal Trim began to make their model fortifications therein. The Mill. The miller was a stout card for the nones. Full biggy he was of brawn, and eke of bones. That proved well, for over alther he came. At wrastling he wold bear away the ram. And that was most of sin, and harlotries. Well could he stellen corn, and tollen thries. Pipen he cooed, and fish, and netties bet. And turnen cups, and wrastlen well and fleet. A whiff he had, common of noble kin. The person of the town higher father was. With higher ye yaff full many a pan of brass. We next visit the mill, which was a necessary adjunct to the manor house when the greatest part of the grain was consumed on the place, or in its immediate vicinity. We have many pleasing remembrances of the old grist mills, where the women of all ranks in the parish used to delight to assemble. And whilst the corn was grinding have a merry dance on the mill bed or outside on the green, the music the miller's fiddle. Or simply the time beaten up on the crowd, sieve covered with sheepskin, or their high-heeled shoes would echo the tune of some lively old ballad that would set them a-going one and all. The mill, too, was the chief place for news, and we fear for a trifle of scandal now and then. We are sorry to see so many of the old grist mills going into disuse, and to find that working people have to purchase flour instead of corn, and that even the farmers must often come to the shopkeepers for their flour. The principal causes for the decay of the old mills are the monopolizing propensities of the flour manufacturers, who have lately sprung up, and the proverbial rascality of the grist millers themselves, who have done much to cut their own throats. By stealing corn and tolling thrice. Trove mill is working still, and we hope the millclack will keep time as long as the stream continues to run, for the sake of the hearty old dames of Burien and Paul, who used to come here and surge, bolt, their own flour. To see that the honest miller mightn't take more than his due. This mill, and the surrounding cottages, formed a pleasing rural feature, a few years ago, when they were half concealed by the embowering trees. Before that side of the hill and vale was stripped bare of the flourishing wood which gave some idea of what the place must once have been, when best part of the hills around were clothed in sheltering groves. As one may be sure they were by the stumps that yet remain about the hedges. We shall often have occasion to revert to this mill, as in many of the legends about TREWOOF and its old inhabitants the miller and his wife are the chief actors. We have noticed all the most important appurtenances of the ancient sea, yet many buildings that we now seldom see near a mansion were considered necessary adjuncts to the manor house. When Lord and Franklin were obliged in great measure to limit the requirements and elegancies of their homes to the produce of their own estate. Then every considerable establishment was like a little colony, with its artisans and manufacturers, who were no longer required, and merchant princes brought from overseas the riches and luxuries of foreign countries which were only known to our forefathers from the tales of pilgrims and crusaders, or from the romances of chivalry. And these distant lands were not regarded by many as more real than Avalon and other fairy realms of those charming fictions. The haunted mill pool of Trove. And the Crusaders. 'Tis I have vowed a pilgrimage unto a distant shrine. And I must seek Jerusalem, and leave the land that's mine. Here shalt thou dwell the while in state, so thou wilt pledge thy fay. That thou for my return wilt wait 7 months and a day. Now here, he said, Sir Chamberlain, true vassal art thou mine. And such the trust that I repose in that proved worth of thine. For 7 years rule thou my towers, and lead my vassal train. And pledge thee for my lady's faith till I return again. Scott. Those who feared, a few years ago, to see a ghost, disliked to pass over the pathway on the bank or hedge which borders the mill pool, and makes a short cut from the bend of the avenue to some cottages near the mill. The dislike to this pathway was not so much from its dangerous proximity to the water, as from the fear of seeing the apparition of 2 children, frequently beheld near the pool. This appearance of 2 beautiful children, wandering about hand in hand, was sometimes seen in the meadow, below, where they seemed to be picking flowers. At other times they were seen sporting like fairies on the margin of the mill stream, or hovering over the water. By all accounts, many were so used to see the apparition of the beautiful babes that they paid no more attention to it than to any other ordinary occurrence. But we suspect that many of the stories told us, when children, about this haunted pool, might have been to deter us, and others of the same age, from venturing near this path on the brink of the water. However that may be, the stories told us then have left a lasting impression, and make us feel that there was always something weird, wished, and strange about that path and dark millstream, although there is now scarce a ghost in all the land. And probably these restless spirits have also departed, with many other unsubstantial beings which used to haunt the vale. Levelis the Crusader. There is a story, or rather a droll, told to account for these appearances, which saith that long ago, probably some hundreds of years before the last of the Levelis was entombed in Burien Church, some noble ancestor of his was left an orphan at a very early age, under the guardianship of his paternal uncle and other gentlemen of the West, who were also connected with the family. These gentlemen did not approve of the manner in which the youth was being brought up by his uncle, who, as he was a younger brother, had but little land and less learning. He seems to have been merely a strong sturdy farmer, who took pride in his calling and cared not a straw for gentilesse. This uncle farmed Trove, with all the other lands near, belonging to the family, and was bringing up the young Levelis as a mere hind. The more liberal guardians, seeing that the heir of the ancient family had there no means of acquiring the accomplishments becoming one of gentle blood, took the youth away from his uncle and got him installed as a squire to a worthy knight belonging to some noble family in a distant part of the country. Here the young heir was trained in all the gentle breeding, and manly and martial exercises, which were regarded as indispensable for the youth of his rank, in those times, when all the flower of the gentry amused themselves with lopping off the heads of Saracens and destroying those idols of Mahomet and Termagant which they were said to find in the Holy Land. A few years after the young heir of Trove had been under the good knight's care he became so jaunty and valiant, courteous and brave, that any Cornish man might be proud to own him. He was young, strong, and virtuous, and riche, and wise, and well beloved, and holden in great prize. Young Levelis was never seen, and rarely heard of, in the West, until the knight, his master, took him, and numerous other followers, to flesh their maiden swords in the Holy War. Then, to the great disgust of his uncle, the little revenue derived from the land, and more money, that was borrowed, and was sent to equip the young squire in a way suitable to his rank. After this departure to the east, so many years passed without any tidings of the young crusader, that his uncle regarded the ancient possessions of the family as all his own. Rumors were common that soldiers had returned from the Jerusalem wars to other parts of the country, bringing word that Levelis of Trove was slain in the battlefield. But no one was seen to confirm these stories, which were probably invented to gratify the wishes of Hugh Levelis, the uncle, who had begun to plant and build, with as much confidence as if his nephew had been doubly dead and buried. Besides, he was preparing to bring a lady home to the hall in a short time. The absent heir seemed to be dead with the consent of one, but one day, when they least expected, he came back as a very jaunty knight, with a wife and 2 children. The lady was said to have belonged to a family of higher rank than the Levelis, that she secretly left her father's house in disguise, and followed her youthful soldier to the wars. Then it was no unusual thing for the wives of commanders, as well as those of lower degree, to accompany their lords to the seat of war in the east, that they might keep watch and ward over their husbands, and guard them from the witcheries of the dark-eyed maids of Palestine, and other dangers of that land of enchantments. Here the story, as told by the old folks, goes on to say how the Levelis in possession refused at first to acknowledge the returned soldier to be his nephew, that those who knew him, when a child, with his uncle, did not remember him then, how, after a long contest, his identity was established by the miller and an old servant of his father proceeding to the part of the country where the knight resided when at home, and bringing thence some persons who knew him well before he went to the wars. Among those were some relatives of the Crusader's lady who knew nothing of her whereabouts or that she had been married to Levelis. They only knew that she had either been stolen, or that she had strayed, and they decently mourned her as dead, hoping she would no more come back to trouble them. When the warrior was reinstated in his lands, the rambling couple were wedded again in Burien Church, and the bells rung then, as they are said to do now, poor man undone. The only reason we know for this fancy is that, what the fool thinketh, that the bell chinketh. It might well be that the uncle and others could not believe that the stout soldier returned from the wars, as brown as a berry and bearded like a Turk, was the same fair stripling who left Trove a score of years before. Yet when the uncle Levelis found that there was no chance of his retaining possession of the property, he seemed glad to be convinced that the returned soldier was his nephew beyond dispute, and so far influenced the unsuspecting nature of the blunt, honest soldier, that he allowed him to manage matters much as he pleased. But the lady felt a repugnance, for which she could not account, to the fawning manner of the sturdy man who was only some dozen years older than her husband, and who, from having always remained attached to his healthy home and occupation, looked even younger than his crusading nephew. The children also, for all his uncouth sweetness, seemed as naturally to avoid their grand uncle as doves shun the hawk. The soldier Levelis, we wish we knew his name, suppose we call him Captain, as almost everyone here is dubbed Captain now. Well, Captain Levelis had scarcely been settled long enow by his native hearth to feel the comfort of it, when he was called away to the wars again, leaving his wife, about to become a mother for the third time, and the two children, to the tender mercies of a disappointed uncle, and among people, who, however hospitable they might have been, often showed a greater antipathy to persons from other parts of England than to people from distant countries. Many persons, who have heard the traditions of the old folks about what they call the Jerusalem Wars and the days of old King John, have come to the conclusion, that long after the time of the Crusaders, some remembrance of the holy wars must have induced enthusiasts, or maniacs, every now and then to stir up the simple folks of the West to a state of frenzy about going to the land of Canaan. Captain Levelis was glad to take advantage of this fury for going to the holy wars, as it gave him a pretence for another ramble to Paynim lands, and for leaving awhile what he found too dull an existence to suit his hot blood, after the stirring life of the camp. His tales, and descriptions of the wonders and treasures of Levantine lands, induced hundreds from the West Country to join his company. If there be any meaning in our traditions of these times, they would seem to show that women, by scores, old as well as young, left their homes with their lovers, husbands, or brothers, to follow the standard of Levelis, on which were seen the three calves' heads in silver sheen, and the sable tower, waving on the breeze. Many lusty squires led the van, accompanied by a great number of the old gentry and yeomanry of the West. These set out with horses and hounds, and hawk on hand, with all their sporting gear, mixed with their arms and other accoutrements. Away they went like a troop of merry huntsmen. Next came the tinners, with their picks on their shoulders, that they might try every pretty keenly piece of ground they should come to on their journey to Jerusalem, whilst the others touched pipe a spell, or went a-hunting. Their ideas about the distance, places, and people to be passed on the way must have been in a state of great confusion. Many of the characters of the miracle plays that most Sundays they flocked to see acted at the Cross in Burien or Sancras church town, were living realities for them. And they believed that the grand Eastern princes spoke the same sweet Cornish lingo as those who acted their parts in the Planninguare at St. Just. The simple folks, having no juster notions of times than of places, confounded the little they hear of things and persons, ancient and modern, and of places near and distant. They believed all the lying modern, all the lying stories of pilgrims and palmers. The more improbable the fiction the firmer and more meritorious their faith. The wandering, restless outlaws, who flocked into the parish to claim the privilege of sanctuary, also brought thither many wonderful tales, which would never be forgotten, when the old sociable life of hunting and the hall was in vogue, when one and all assembled round the winter's fire to droll the time away. Nothing could restrain their impatience to depart. Some few tin streamers left on horseback, one beast between several cousin Johnnies, who intended to ride and tie all the way to Jericho, where they would sell the horse in the first Corpus Christi fair, after they got there. But the crowd of common folks went on foot, armed with their knotty blackthorn sticks, or such rude weapons as the blacksmith, or their own invention, could contrive. The women loaded themselves with such choice household utensils and garments as were intended to give the pagans of the East a high idea of the refinement of the West. Some took with them the small treadle turns they spun the flax with, that they might teach the women of Jerusalem, Jericho, or Babylon how to spin with a better contrivance than the distaff and reel. One dame of Escal's, a noted knitster, filled her knapsacks of pockets, made large for the occasion, with balls of the finest yarn, that she might knit, by the way, some of the most beautiful stockings that ever were seen for Solomon's queen. Or the king of Babylon. A great part of the crowd was composed of those who were not determined whether they would go all the way, or only so far as to see the rest set sail. A large portion of these were old women perched on pillions behind their good men, whom they saw off with streaming eyes, but they took good care to bring back the old grey mare, with some youngster, picked up on the road, riding before them. And many who firmly resolved to go to Jericho went no farther than Relubus or Fraddam. They had never been out of the smoke of their own chimneys before, and little thought the world was so large and so round, until they had a good view of it from the high hills of Crowan and Brieg. They took with them so much of fuggins, hoggins, and pasties, that they were glad to stop often, to lighten the load and keep up their strength the first day. So they sat themselves down and finished off a pasty each one, on the bank of every clear stream they passed. They had little care for the morrow. Surely the Lord would provide, weren't they going to the Holy War? They might drop into anybody's house about dinner time, and get a basin of broth, to be sure, if nothing better, and a bowl of pilla's porridge, morning and evening, from some hospitable body, living near the roadside, would do. They had made up their minds not to be too particular on the score of lodgings. As it was about midsummer they could sleep during the short nights in the barns or by the side of a hayrick, anywhere. When they got to the land of Canaan they would have a good blow-out and rest, to make up for all the hardships of the road before they began to fight the pagans. The ignorance of the poor folks, and their inborn love of the marvelous, added to their illusion. They were prepared to see miracles and wonders in everything they found different from what they had been accustomed to. Everything unusual wore an air of enchantment for them, and the hope of seeing wonders and prodigies had as much, or more, to do in making many go off in a wild goose chase to the east than anything they cared about Jerusalem or Jericho, being occupied by Turks or Christians. Yet each felt sure that when they got there they would beat the idols of Mahomet and Termagant all to brus and brilliants, fragments, as they said. Everyone was certain of dispatching his baker's dozen of Turkish knights, like Boldesti George in the Guise dance. A few days after the West Country female crusaders had departed, full of fine fancies, many of them turned tail and came home again, as the pleasures of travelling did not answer to their expectations. Others, who had more pluck, or more regard for their male companions, pushed on and continued their journey. Whenever they came in sight of any town or village, larger than Mousehole or Market Jew, or waded through a broader brook than the streams of Talcarn or Ponsondain, those in the rear would push ahead to the leaders' ranks, to inquire if the waters they had then passed were the river Jordan, the village on the moor Jericho, or the town on the distant hill Jerusalem. The commanders knew but little better than their followers about the countries they were going to. Hundreds of the fighting men and women left their ranks long before they reached the Tamar, and arrived home, after long and weary wanderings from one side of the county to the other, in their vain endeavours to find a short cut to Burien. Our Cornish warriors were right, however, to come back safe and sound, and let Levelis and St. George slay the dragons and the Turkish knights whilst they stayed at home to raise the tin, and tell their drolls. We must next see how it fared with the strange lady and her children during the absence of the Crusaders, who travelled over Jordan. Madame Levelis, being a native of some place east of Cornwall, was regarded as a foreigner by the people of the West, whom she could not understand. And feeling herself like one alone among strangers, she was rarely seen beyond her bower, the private garden, or in the oriel over the porch. After her husband's departure, Madame rarely entered the hall, and although an excellent horsewoman, never joined the other ladies of the neighbourhood in their enjoyment of the chase, or to see the games of hurling, wrestling, and other manly exercises then in vogue. Her only companions were her children and a dark-complexioned damsel who came with her from abroad. Although the uncle, Hugh Levelis, managed all the business connected with the property, Madame seldom condescended to speak with the rough farmer, in the hall, and he was rarely admitted into the more private apartments of the mansion. The children were never allowed to leave the house and gardens. Yet when, by stealth, they could escape their prison they would wander miles away along the road, over the moor and hills, where they last saw their father and the gay cavalcade that left for the wars. And inquire of all they met where their father was gone. At other times, like wild March hares, they would run down to the cliffs and hide among the cairns. Another son was born, a few weeks after the departure of Levelis. Now the lady and her children were scarcely ever seen for a year or more, the mistress and her maid, who were both most skilful in many curious kinds of needlework, passed great part of their time in the garden bower, where they worked from the first daylight till dark, in making a piece of tapestry in which was portrayed the lifelike image of the absent lord, arrayed in his glittering armor, with sword in hand, just as he appeared when setting out for the wars. This work was completed, yet never seen nor heard of, until long after, by anyone but the lady and her maid. This tapestry picture was hung over a door of the lady's chamber, opening into an outer room, and covered over by the old heiress. The lady intended the picture to be a pleasing surprise for her absent soldier, and to be seen by no one but herself until his return. Years passed away without bringing any tidings of the Crusaders, or only such rumors as caused great fears that Captain Levelis, and many others, were killed or imprisoned by the Saracens. In the meantime, Hugh Levelis became madly in love with the disdainful dame whom he honestly believed to be now a widow, and that she required a husband to protect and console her. The old bachelor was in love to that degree that he was ready to eat rocks, and tame tigers, to gain the lady's favor. No woman could withstand his vehement wooing in suit so strongly urged, much less an unprotected widow. But when the lady consented there was still another and more trying obstacle to their lawful union, because Hugh Levelis, by his nephew's marriage, was become a sort of Cornish cousin to the lady. At any rate they were within the prohibited degrees of matrimony. Yet as a remedy to this the all-powerful clergy could grant dispensation, if sufficient money and lands were bestowed on Holy Mother Church. In that case the powers above, as well as those below, were thought to be so indulgent as to wink at a little pleasant sinning. In these good old times, everything that the liberal, open-handed sinner desired was granted. The jolly priests ate roast beef, and the simple people stared, wondered, and admired. At last the lady came to regard the rough and hearty farmer Hugh with all the favour required, and, for as much as could be wrung out of the parties, leave was obtained to their union, from those who claimed the power to bind and loose. And a day was fixed for their wedding. The women had all declared that such a husband as Uncle Hugh was far better than none, or one far away. Long before dawn, on the day intended for the bridal, all the household were busy at work preparing for the feast and revel. In the midst of the bustle, no one watched the two elder children, who, for once, were allowed to range at their own sweet will. No one knew what was become of them when their mother wanted to kiss them, before the party proceeded to church. Then the young heir and his little sister were not to be found. During all that day the wedding guests, servants, and neighbours made diligent search all down the vale to Lamarna, over hill and cliff, moor and downs, in the Fugo hole, and every other place thought of, whither the children used to wander. All was in vain, since sunrise they had not been seen by mortal eye. After many days of fruitless search, some thought they might have gone down to the cove at low water, and wandered out onto the rocks which were surrounded by the sea at half-tide, and that the waves, which soon swept over them, had taken the children to the mermaids' home. Or that the wolves, said to be plentiful then, might have come down from the hills miles away, and carried them off. Others surmised that they might have been taken away by the outlandish merchants who traded to Market Jew for tin, and who were accused in old times of kidnapping beautiful children and selling them to Turks and pagans. In short, so many ways in which they might be lost were thought of that the wonder seemed to be that any children were ever reared in the country. The sudden woe cut short the joy of the assembled guests, and made the mother feel that the loss of her children was a judgment on her for so soon consenting to receive another spouse, and, by way of penance, she avoided all the world and Hugh Levelis. The uncle was sadly disappointed by such a slip between the cup and the lip, after all the trouble he had taken, and the time he lost in wooing the dame. The sad disappointment must have made Uncle Hugh crazy, or he would never have taken to the outrageous plan, contrived by him and the nurse, who wanted more occupation. By the connivance or assistance of this shameful woman, Hugh Levelis was concealed in a closet of Madame's bedchamber. That he might have an opportunity of persuading her that the loss of the children was an additional reason for their speedy marriage, that if she ever intended to leave off mourning, and to rejoice any more, she might as well make up her mind to being first as last, and no doubt he thought of proposing many other arguments to the same effect. At the instant he was about to leave the closet, to put his designs in practice, the lady's good angel awoke her, and seeing, by the blazing wood fire light, the closet door open and a man emerging, she rushed through a doorway, which was covered by tapestry, into the outer room. At the instant she passed the doorway, Uncle Hugh, thinking to stop the dame by grasping her dress, caught the old heiress instead, which, falling from the hooks to which it was hung, brought the eager lover face to face with an apparition of the armed crusader. The sight of this ghastly vision, which Hugh Levelis thought to be the spirit of his nephew, with sword in hand to defend his wife, made the warm lover's blood run cold, and he fell on the floor in a swoon, where he was found insensible. After Madame Levelis had alarmed the servants, and led the way to her chamber, where they found the terror-stricken man, who, when raised in the arms of the servants from the floor, opened his eyes. And again beholding the apparition, in the tapestry picture, waving in the wind, it gave him such a fright that he sprang through the chamber window into the garden, ran from the house, and could not be persuaded to return. He less feared 100 men than one such frightful ghost. One morning, a short time after Hugh's night adventure, Madame Levelis, being unable to rest, with grieving over her lonely widowed state, arose long before her household and sat with the child in her lap at her bower window looking into the garden. She was soon startled from her reverie, by seeing a man, travel-stained and worn, pacing up and down the garden alley. Notwithstanding the bad plight and poverty-stricken appearance of the stranger, there was no mistaking the martial bearing of the crusader. Yet the lady was at first more inclined to believe that she beheld the ghost of her husband than the real man, in good substantial flesh and blood. Between hopes and fears, she shrieked out his name, and in an instant was clasped in his arms. He related to her how he and 3 other West Country men, all that lived to return of the scores who went with him to the east, had, the night before, come ashore from an outlandish ship, which brought them to Market Jew. They had travelled all night without meeting any person they knew, or who could give them any tidings of their families. They were all in bad plight, having returned heartily tired and disgusted with seeing the butchery of thousands of the simple innocent people who assembled from all quarters of the world to slay each other on the bloody plains of Palestine, merely to gratify the mad ambition of priests and princes. Levelis, and the few men of the West, who lived to reach the land of Canaan, always kept together, come fair, come foul, one and all would share alike. His company, at the commencement of the first engagement, Cornish men like, despising their enemy in all precaution, in their headlong undisciplined valor, fought their way into the midst of the Saracen host, and, being overpowered by numbers, Levelis, and the 3 who returned with him, were taken prisoners, and conducted to the castle of a Saracen chief far into the interior of the country. Here they were well treated. Ans saw that those whom they were led to believe idolaters and pagans were less barbarous than many reputed Christians. During the long time of their honorable captivity they were allowed to pass the time much as they pleased, until they might either be ransomed or exchanged for Saracen prisoners of war. They might have had their liberty before, but they were too proud as Cornish men, to be exchanged for ordinary soldiers, or to purchase their liberty at a low price, and it was only about 6 months before their return that they were partly ransomed and partly exchanged at their own valuation. Then Levelis and his companions were taken to the Christian camp with a guard of honor, preceded by heralds and accompanied by every other circumstance to show mutual respect. A few days after they regained their liberty, Levelis was riding slowly over a dreary plain towards the place of a late battlefield, to see if among the dead, or dying, any of his old comrades were to be found. He was thinking of his distant home and wishing to return, yet undecided, when his horse suddenly stopped, and looking up to see what disturbed his steed, he saw, on the road before him, in a line with the setting sun, that had just disappeared behind the mountains, the apparition of a beautiful boy and girl, seemingly floating in water and surrounded by trees, yet their motions were as free as the birds in the air. The boy held the little maiden with one hand, in the other he grasped a green hazel branch, and the girl a garland of flowers, which they waved as a signal of joy to the horsemen. Then they beckoned towards the rose-colored clouds on the western mountains. The fair vision remained whilst the Crusader said a Pater and Ave Maria. At the words, "Now, and at the hour of our death," the beautiful children, waving their green branches and flowers, as if bidding the horsemen adieu, floated away like a pair of white doves till lost to sight in the brilliant clouds of the western sky. Whilst the Crusader was entranced with mournful music, mingled with the wail of familiar voices far away, the spectral pool and grove vanished into thin air. Legolas hesitated no longer. He knew that what he had just seen was a token for him to return, and he believed his children to be drowned, as the scene that surrounded the lovely boy and girl was the well-remembered nut grove and mill pond of Trove. A few weeks after, this Legolas and his companions arrived at a seaport, where they found a ship bound to Marketjew for tin. No more was then recounted of the wanderers' adventures. They wanted food and rest. Legolas knew that his children were drowned. The vision seen in a foreign land informed him where and when, yet he said but little, that he might not renew the mother's grief. In the evening of the day on which the Crusader arrived, the same apparition that appeared to him on the drear white plains of Palestine, met him in the avenue, as if to welcome the wanderer home, then glided away and vanished over the mill pool. The next day, by the direction of Legolas, the miller, assisted by the neighbors, drained the pond, and close in under the bank, on the opposite side of the water from the path, the bodies of the two children were found. The noble boy still grasped his sister with one hand, in the other he held a branch of hazel, with the clustering nuts on the twigs which tempted them to their watery grave. The strong current had taken the children so far in under the overhanging bank, full of matted roots and drooping branches, that their bodies were not seen until the water was drained off. Portions of the children's clothes found in the thickets far away on the moors, showed that they had wandered about a great part of the day, and had been drowned in the afternoon, at the time their phantoms were seen by their father. When the dying appear, to those on whom their last thoughts dwell, it is stated to be always at the moment the spirit leave the body. The earthly remains of the two children were solemnly placed to repose in Burien Church, amongst the other Legolas dust, yet their bright spirits long delighted to revisit the sunny meadows, clear streams, and pleasant groves of Trove. As no more is heard of the Crusader Legolas, we suppose that for the rest of his days he remained at home in peace, plenty, and content.